Well, they come as if from outer space in a variety of weird guises. Defender, Pac-Man, asteroids. To fans, they represent a challenge. But to critics, as Terry Drinkwater reports, they are a menace.
When you hear someone talking about controversial video games that caused backlash in the media, the examples that come to your mind are usually games that went too far with violence or delved into certain sensitive topics. In the modern era, this typically includes action experiences where the gore and aggressive gameplay are next level, or horror games in which the story uses disturbing references that might not be suitable for everyone.
We couldn't show the rest of the trailer because simply it's just too graphic and just really disturbing. I mean, we were watching it this morning and we all had our mouths kind of open. We could not believe what we were watching.
However, what if I told you that the most notorious video game in history is neither modern nor has anything to do with the common perception of action and horror in gaming? Well, this is the surprising topic of today's video, because unlike our typical style of discussing horror games and explaining their backstories, the game in question this time is not horror by definition, but the lore behind it and the mysterious concept that led to its creation are the scary parts that resulted in its infamous legacy. Without further ado, let's dive right into it. In the 1970s, video games started to spread and gain mainstream popularity for the first time ever, because these years saw the rise of commercial gaming and home console systems, which became widely available to the public. This decade was a cultural and technological phenomenon in every sense, and people were experiencing something that they never thought was possible. The most significant development was the release of the Atari in 1977, a console that you can use in your own living room and allows you to buy and swap different games, which was a feature that took the entire market by storm. However, in the 1980s, the video game industry began to shift, and people's eyeballs were more focused on a specific side of gaming that was considered more enjoyable and challenging, but also much more addictive. I'm talking about none other than arcade games. And even though they were already available in the 1970s, the 80s was the golden age in which they flourished and became the driving force in digital entertainment worldwide. For example, in 1980, the release of Pac-Man was a global sensation that broke away from the usual genre of shooters. The non-violent maze chase gameplay appealed to a much broader audience, including women and casual players, leading the game to become the first icon for the industry because it was recognizable for everyone, regardless of their age.
Yellow creature gobbles dots while being pursued through maze by monsters. Believe it or not, those things are really happening on 200 electronic video games here at Chicago Fest. What you see here is part of a national phenomenon that we call high-tech rec.
Following this huge success, similar experiences were released later on, and people literally became obsessed with putting their coins in the machines and delving into a virtual world where their skills are put to the test. The reason behind this unique dedication is because arcade games at the time were the epitome of technology when it came to gaming, and they had certain graphics, sound designs, and controls that were far more advanced than home consoles. With that being said, in November 1980, the company Stern Electronics released an arcade game designed by the genius programmer Alan McNeil. But unlike Pac-Man, this one comes back to the popular formula of shooters. The game in question is called Berserk, and it allows you to control a green stick figure humanoid navigating through a series of randomly generated maze-like rooms. The objective is to destroy all the patrolling robots in each room and escape to the next, while avoiding being shot, touching the deadly walls, or running into a robot. But what made Berserk stand out among its peers is that the robots can speak and threaten the player with phrases like,
"The humanoid must not escape. Destroy the humanoid."
Now, if you're someone who's used to the modern standards of technology, you're probably wondering how this is impressive. But for people in the 1980s, this was actually the first time ever that they heard video game characters speaking in gameplay. The surprises don't end here, because the most enticing element in the game is something called the Evil Auto, which is a bouncing smiley face that shows up in certain sections. This enemy is invincible, and it can move through walls and chase you relentlessly, forcing you to either escape or die, especially since defeating it is impossible. Long story short, Berserk was unique, fun, and incredibly challenging. It offers completely unpredictable scenarios through its randomly generated mazes, while also adding a realistic touch by making the enemies speak, a combination that blew people's minds.
Certainly. National Theatre for you, my liege. Oh! Very funny. No, not now, love. It's busy. Pathetic.
However, even though arcade games were popular for being a source of joy and entertainment, they still had a dark side that was getting more and more worrying over time. Due to their innovative mechanics and exciting content, many people in the 1980s were too fascinated and engaged, reaching a point where the games became a central part of their daily life. Simply put, arcade games were the definition of addiction, and the fans had a hard time moving away from the machines and going back to real life. But make no mistake, certain games were much more addictive than others. And if we had to rank which one reigns supreme in this department, Berserk would probably be the undisputed champion. The main reason is that the game's controls are very simple, making it easy for anyone to pick up and play. But the catch is that the gameplay is not a walk in the park, and it actually requires a high level of skill to complete all the missions. The fact that each room is different and any single mistake can be fatal gave players a powerful sense of thrill when they escaped, especially since the Evil Auto is a challenge that forced many people to give up. And if you're familiar with the rabbit hole of these games back then, you definitely realize that reaching a high score was the goal of every player who touched the machine.
John Jones made more than 20 million points after playing for 41 hours on a quarter. The record is nearly 26 million points.
So, when you combine a game that requires skills with a scoring system that highlights talented players, you basically get zombie-like humans who are stuck in front of a machine for hours, which is exactly what happened with Berserk. As a result, the media began a vicious campaign against these games, highlighting their damaging effects and how they're becoming a serious threat for the mental health of younger players, who developed a clear obsession with them.
We'll see health warning labels anytime soon on video games, but it is true that too much of a good thing can be hazardous to your health.
Linda, this is the next generation of video games, but these ones are not just for kids. There are a lot of grown-ups hopelessly hooked as well.
But just when fans were ready to push back against these claims and debunk them, something horrible happened. On January 12, 1981, a 19-year-old boy named Jeff Daly decided to go to his local arcade in Suffolk City, Virginia, so he could play Berserk specifically. Jeff was a huge fan of Berserk, and he played it on a regular basis. But this time, he played the game for long hours, and was eager to rack up as many high scores as he could before leaving the shop. He kept pushing and pushing until he reached the score of 16,660. But a few seconds later, Jeff began to crumple, and he suddenly fell to the ground, motionless. Everyone in the shop ran to see what happened to him, but sadly, it was too late, because Jeff was already dead at that point. According to reports, the boy suffered a severe heart attack that led him to collapse entirely in a short time, leaving him with no chance to seek help. The exact cause remains a mystery, but the main reason that was suggested is that Jeff may have had a heart issue that has never been diagnosed, and he probably went through sudden cardiac arrest that ended up being deadly. On the other side, some experts stated that stress and adrenaline can have a big role in such conditions, especially when the person is going through a very intense experience that combines concentration and excitement, which is exactly how Berserk works. Jeff's case stood out because heart attacks among teenagers are very rare, and the fact that it happened immediately after gaming created the idea that the game itself was dangerous. The theory was amplified by some scary speculations regarding the last score that Jeff achieved, which is 16,660. People who were invested in arcade gossip and urban legends could not help but focus on the number 666 in the score, which is widely known as the sign of the devil. These rumors spread like fire because in the early 1980s, moral panics about video games and satanic influences were already very common in the US. So when a coincidence like this was picked up, many people started exaggerating the details to prove that Berserk was actually cursed. With that said, Jeff's story is not fully confirmed, and there are multiple contradictions that make us unable to understand what really happened. What we know is that his death was initially reported in a gaming magazine called Video Ace in 1981, and later on, it was mentioned in various other publications, but without clear verifications. Anyway, people eventually moved on, and the panic was slowly fading away, because the event was not properly documented and the details were mysterious. However, 1 year later, on April 3rd, 1982, an 18-year-old teenager by the name of Peter Bukowski woke up on a snowy morning and went to Friar Tuck's game room, a popular arcade in Chicago. When he arrived, he knew very well what game he wanted to play, and as you can guess, his favorite game was obviously Berserk. Within 15 minutes, he managed to get his initials on the high score leaderboard twice, and in arcade culture, this is a big accomplishment that makes any player insanely proud. The boy was very skilled in the game, and he had experience playing it. But a few seconds after his achievement, he stepped away from the machine and went toward the doorway, before he suddenly collapsed on the ground. People did not hesitate, and they called help very quickly, hoping that Peter would be fine. But shortly after arriving in the hospital and spending some time in emergency care, the doctors revealed that he died. His death became a national story across the country because this time the case was documented by newspapers, authorities, and so many witnesses, meaning that it was very hard to ignore the event. The official diagnosis indicated that Peter has had a heart condition for some time, and it made him vulnerable to heart attacks, especially when he pushes himself to the limit. But even though doctors did not provide any external factors behind what happened, the public was so quick to think about Berserk. Nevertheless, the media made sure to publish headlines connecting Peter's death to video games by highlighting how the tragedy happened while he was playing Berserk. The fact that Peter's collapse took place in public in a busy arcade also meant that so many people saw the incident firsthand, which led to a growing panic and a lot of theories related to Berserk. Eventually, the autopsy results came out, and the Dr. Mark Allen stated that they investigated the possibility that video game stress was the direct cause of death, but he refused to give a final answer and did not want to either confirm or debunk this claim.
Some argue that players get so hypnotized by these games that they have little time for anything else. How many hours do you play it?
I don't know, 6 or 7.
A day?
Regardless of any official statements, by that time, the media and the population had already concluded that Peter's death was clearly a result of certain dynamics related to playing Berserk, which is a reasonable conclusion if we're being honest. Following this tragedy, Peter Bukowski has become the first reported death in history that is directly related to video games. And even though there were some similar incidents before him, his death was the first to be fully documented and investigated. But for many, he was the second teenager who died while playing Berserk within 1 year, because many magazines were mentioning Daly and Bukowski in the same context, which cemented the idea that Berserk was somehow deadly. For the next few years, there were no reports of anyone facing the same fate as Peter or Jeff, and due to the big number of games releasing every month, players were too busy to focus on the old news surrounding Berserk. But little did they know, the disturbing phenomenon of Berserk was far from being over. On March 20, 1988, the night was unusually warm, and a 17-year-old teenager called Edward Clark was walking through the River Oaks Plaza in Chicago, a place where he often spent time with his friends. Clark was known among the locals, and after a few minutes of exploring the area, he decided to step inside Friar Tuck. And if you were paying attention to the video, you obviously remember that this is the same game room where Peter Bukowski died 6 years ago. Clark played multiple arcade games and was having so much fun doing so. But then, he wanted to move on to another machine, so he could play Berserk. For some reason, he found a few coins on this machine that were left by another player, meaning that he can use those coins to play for free, which is very normal in arcade games because many players tend to leave the shop before finishing their sessions. Nevertheless, Clark was happy with this discovery, and he used one coin to start the game. As he was playing and enjoying his time, a 16-year-old boy started walking toward his machine, looking for nothing other than trouble. This boy is called Pedro Roberts, and he was very angry at Clark because, according to him, the coins were his, and Clark had no right to take them. Clark knew that these claims were BS and that Roberts was clearly trying to enforce his dominance to intimidate him. As a result, he refused to leave the machine, and he told Roberts to back off, leading the argument to end at this point because Roberts seemingly accepted his defeat. But just when everyone thought Roberts was stepping back, he suddenly escalated the dispute and pulled an actual knife to threaten Clark and his friends. This is when the staff in the arcade intervened, and they removed Roberts from the shop, hoping that this would be the end of this horrible conflict. But to be safe, the staff allowed Clark and his friends to stay in the shop for 10 more minutes, and before leaving, they advised them to walk in the opposite direction so they could avoid Roberts. The group ignored their advice, and this is very sad because this decision will have horrifying consequences a few minutes later. The staff had a sense that Roberts was not planning to give up by leaving the shop, and they were actually right because after walking away, Roberts found a spot nearby and he was waiting. And since Clark and his friends decided to go in the usual direction, the confrontation with Roberts was only a matter of time. In a shocking moment, when Clark was passing by the alleyway, Roberts ran out and stabbed him in the chest without any hesitation before escaping the scene. Initially, Clark thought that he was okay, and he even refused to let his friends call the ambulance. But moments later, he collapsed on the ground and was taken to the hospital as fast as possible. Sadly, Clark did not make it, and he was declared dead upon his arrival, making his fate a complete tragedy. Roberts was then arrested, and he only served 11 years in jail due to his young age. But in my opinion, this sentence is laughable, and it doesn't give Clark the justice that he deserved. It simply means that the killer was set free in his 20s, while Clark's family and friends lost their loved one forever. It's also worth mentioning that a witness said that the stabbing took place inside the shop and not outside, but this was not fully confirmed. However, what caught people's attention the most is that the last game Clark was playing before his death was the one and only Berserk, and the entire debacle happened just when Clark was trying to play it, and not during his previous sessions. This coincidence revived the memories of Peter Bukowski and Jeff Daly, who died shortly after playing Berserk in the early 1980s. And even though Clark did not die as a result of a heart attack, it didn't stop people and the media from linking Berserk with death. Some said that the game is cursed and it had supernatural effects, while others speculated that the incredibly addictive nature of the gameplay has a strong impact on the brains of teenagers, which can push them to violence when they're not allowed to play. The intriguing part is that there's actually some truth to these claims, and Berserk is not completely innocent. When the panic around Berserk started back in the 1980s, it was relatively easy to dismiss the supernatural claims that some people spread about the game. But when it comes to the claims regarding its influence on the body and the brain, this is a serious discussion. For example, if you focus on the concept behind the gameplay, you'll find out that it's technically a loop with no limit, meaning that despite having a restricted program, your mind can still convince you that you can play for long hours without finishing all the possible scenarios. Although the mission is simple and it's all about shooting robots and surviving, every time you move to the next room, it's always a different challenge because they are randomly generated to keep you curious. You're pushed all the time, so you can see how far you can go, and just when you think you have won, the game slaps you with another scenario, forcing you to say, "one more room." For the average player in the 1980s, this was not a regular video game. It was basically a magic spell that provided unlimited entertainment on a screen right in front of them. On top of that, the game is easy on paper, which allows it to attract as many people as possible. But once they become invested in it, they realize that they need sharp reflexes, spatial awareness, and skills, making it a personal challenge for players who want to stand out. Now, if you take all these elements and combine them with talking enemies and a bizarre bouncing ball that hunts you down, you get yourself an experience that feels like a drug. Every time you consume some, your body and brain want more and more, which can be very dangerous for certain teenagers. According to medical experts, the real issue is not the game itself, but it's actually the dynamic that happens while playing it. Berserk is an exceptionally intense experience because robots attack all the time, and if you hesitate or make one single mistake, the evil auto comes after you. This design forces you to panic and triggers a fight or flight response, which eventually causes your adrenaline to increase, your heart to beat faster, and your blood pressure to go higher. For healthy people, this might not be very risky, but for players with a vulnerable heart, this can be a recipe for disaster. When it comes to the brain, the excitement behind playing Berserk is also much more effective with teenagers than you think. Scientifically, the brains of teens are more sensitive to dopamine than adult brains. And when they get used to normal activities like studying or going to school, a game like Berserk can actually be overestimated in the minds of youngsters, resulting in a strong dose of dopamine funneling inside their heads.
You can't get hooked on it.
Are you?
Yeah. It keeps on making you play the game. Once you start to play it for a while, you keep on playing it.
Any normal person would want to beat the machine.
And you come back?
Oh, sure.
Again?
Oh, sure.
Again?
Yeah.
The doctors explained that this is why younger people are very comfortable with ignoring hunger, sleep, or responsibility just to keep playing. Because in their perspective, the game is more important, and self-control is not a priority. So besides messing with their hearts, the insanely enticing experience of playing Berserk forces many teenagers to become anxious and angry when someone separates them from the game, which might explain why Roberts lost his mind against Clark and was ready to kill him just because he was standing in the way between him and Berserk. And by the way, don't make the mistake of comparing the impact of video games in the 20th century with the modern era. Because trust me when I tell you that the excitement and obsession that video games caused in the 1980s are infinitely more powerful than today. The world at that time was dealing with something they don't fully understand. And for younger people, video games sometimes were a matter of life and death. I say this because the tragic stabbing of Clark was not an isolated incident. And if you think Roberts lost control very easily, then let me introduce you to Siobhan Jones, an 11-year-old girl that turned into a monster for a shockingly casual reason. On October 29, 1982, Siobhan and her friend were playing Crazy Kong at the Speed Queen Laundry in Ohio. And if you're finding this location to be bizarre, you should keep in mind that arcade machines back then were everywhere, even in places where you come to wash your clothes. Nevertheless, the two girls were very focused on the game, and their eyes were stuck on the screen. But at one point, a 14-year-old boy named Charles Moore stepped in and began to tease the girls and interrupt them. Siobhan was very angry about Charles annoying her while she was playing, and as time passed, the argument between the boy and the girls got more intense and escalated very fast, leading Siobhan to engage in a physical altercation with him. At first, everything was limited to pushing and yelling, but when Charles showed no intention to go away, the little girl grabbed a knife and stabbed him one time in the heart. This attack was enough to end the boy's life a few hours later in the hospital, and when police reacted by arresting the girl, they were baffled by her age. Some witnesses stated that the girl used the knife because she felt threatened. But what made the story more unique in the media is that the main reason behind her initial anger is believed to be the boy's verbal comments regarding her performance in the game and her score. During those years, it was widely known that younger players take scores in arcade games very seriously, which means that interrupting them or mocking their gameplay can actually trigger them and make them go crazy. With that being said, we don't really know if the girl was obsessed with the game or not, or why exactly she felt the need to stab the boy. But for society, those details didn't really matter, because the fact that a video game was involved served as fuel for a phenomenon called arcade panic. What many people fail to grasp about the Berserk incidents is that they became infamous precisely because they occurred during an era when arcade games themselves were perceived as a cultural threat in every sense. I'm not just talking about concerns over teenagers playing too much or video games being bad for health, but I actually mean that many people, officials, and even governments saw the games as a psychological disease that's destroying the brains of the youth and turning them into zombies.
In 1978, a new Japanese machine appeared on American shores. Although it looked innocent enough, this machine turned out to have some unusual powers. It kept kids mesmerized for hours, made teenage boys forget about girls, and even caused business executives to skip the 3-martini lunch.
In order to help you understand how significant this panic was, I need you to zoom out and see how the world reacted to video games back in the 1980s, when they began to spread like a virus. For instance, if we go to Asia, we'll find that in 1981, the Filipino president Ferdinand Marcos ordered video game machines to be dismantled and made a threat to operators to surrender their machines to the military within 15 days or face severe consequences. In other words, the Filipino government literally treated arcade games as a security threat that needed to be dealt with, even with force if necessary. Over the years, other countries like Malaysia followed a similar formula, and in 1983, they banned the use of video games in public spaces, and the move specifically targeted arcade games. The parents had a serious problem with seeing their children's minds getting swallowed by these machines every single day. The same sentiments were present in Singapore, where the government also cracked down on arcade games by banning their commercials and heavily limiting the access to machines in most of the country. The trend remained a reality in many parts of the world in the 1980s, and even in the United States, various cities and towns passed several laws against the arcade business. These laws included forcing operators to stop allowing minors to play without the presence of their parent, limiting the number of machines per location, and making it much harder for new shops to gain a license. Many critics at the time referred to the business model as evil, and they were very angry about how its main purpose was robbing you of your money, your time, and even your soul.
The Whewell's game ban ordinance will probably come up before the City Council next month. And next year, the U.S. Supreme Court will decide whether such age restrictions are constitutional. a decision that's vitally important to the entire coin-operated industry and Pac-maniacs and everybody else.
When we look at these reactions from a modern perspective, most of us will consider them to be extreme, outlandish, and senseless. But at the same time, we can still see that the confusion had some reasonable basis. As I said earlier, many arcade games were indeed incredibly addictive, and in the case of Berserk, the dynamic of gameplay was disturbingly hypnotic for teenagers, reaching a point where the movements on the screen felt like they were intentionally designed to keep your eyes unable to look away. In fact, this notion led many skeptics back then to come up with a theory suggesting that some arcade games were used by the CIA for psychological experiments on the public, and specifically the youth. This resulted in the birth of a very infamous urban legend known as Polybius. For those who don't know, Polybius is a mysterious arcade game that was supposedly available in certain shops in Portland, Oregon, during the early 1980s. According to witnesses, the game was different than anything they had seen before, and the people who played it became obsessed very fast and were lining up to play again and again and again. They said that it wasn't just fun or exciting, it was also mesmerizing and soothing, and seemed like it made your brain lose control because of how organized the movements on the screen were. The problem, however, is that the existence of this game was never confirmed, even though some people mentioned that they have clear recollections of its gameplay, and they gave descriptions of how it worked. Some rumors even stated that there were men in black suits who came to the arcades and looked like they were extracting data from the machines, but again, this remains a theory to this very day. But to be clear, this is not a theory that only some random Reddit users are discussing online. It's actually a big deal that the huge news organizations were also interested in investigating it and verifying whether the legend is more real than we think. Anyway, I don't have anything else to say for now, but if there's something we can learn from this whole mess, it has to be that you should really advise your loved ones to avoid certain video games if they have health issues. Despite the exaggeration of people's paranoia in the 1980s, it's actually a fact that intense games with high motion and fast reactions can be dangerous for both adults and teenagers if they are already suffering from a vulnerable heart. And by the way, believe it or not, one of the things that helped in normalizing video games over the last few decades was none other than home consoles. The rise of PlayStation and the astonishing innovation of domestic machines like Nintendo made it easier for people to abandon the arcade machine and enjoy their hobby at home. If you found this video informative, make sure to like it, and you can also join the channel and become a member if you want to support us. And in case you love to hear about horrifying urban legends that shockingly ended up being true, I advise you to watch our previous video. With that said, see you next time.
Remember, do not underestimate the power of PlayStation.